Good evening, everyone. Is this working? Great. My name is Neil Levesque. I'm the executive director here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, here for a very special night. It's great speakers. We are doing a lot of work now with the World Affairs Council, and this is a partnership with them. We're very pleased about that. And for purposes of introduction, I want to introduce to you James Tebow, who is our the youngest state representative, I believe, in the nation, and also, of course, one of our students here at St. Anselm College. James.
Thank you, Neil. I thought we were going to leave politics out of it tonight, so that was a nice surprise. But good evening. Welcome to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. Before we begin, I would like to point your attention to the 2 emergency exits at the back, and would ask that you please silence any cell phones you might have. As Neil said, my name is James Tebow. I'm a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador here at the Institute of Politics. The Institute is nonpartisan and doesn't endorse any candidates or policies, rather existing to educate and engage citizens in civic life. No one did a better job of engaging people in politics than President Ronald Reagan, so it is for that reason I am pleased to welcome you all here for a discussion with Max Boot, author of the best-selling book Reagan, His Life and Legend, co-sponsored by the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Mr. Boot is a best-selling author, historian, and columnist for the Washington Post. He also serves as the Jeane J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council for Foreign Relations, previously serving as a foreign policy advisor for the McCain, Romney, and Rubio presidential campaigns. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Drew Cline, a true staple of New Hampshire public service. He serves as the president of the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy, a nonpartisan free market think tank dedicated to the continued prosperity of New Hampshire's small government advantage, fittingly named for New Hampshire's first governor. Mr. Cline previously served as an award-winning editor for the New Hampshire Union Leader and also on various state boards and commissions. Mr. Boot and Mr. Cline will be discussing the legacy of President Reagan in the modern day. Afterward, there will be a brief question and answer period, followed by a book signing where you can purchase a copy of his book, which I highly recommend. Throughout the event, if you'd like to ask a question, there is a table in the back where you can fill out an index card and just submit a question, and those will be collected before the Q&A, and we will just read them off. But with that, please welcome Max Boot and Drew Cline.
Are you on? We have to turn our devices on to make sure. Yeah.
Okay, is this on now?
It's on.
All right.
All right. Welcome, everybody.
My priceless joke got lost in the...
Well, now you can repeat it now that everybody can hear it. All right. So welcome. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here at the IOP, and I would like to say I recognize a lot of faces in the crowd, but if you aren't on the New Hampshire IOP's mailing list, shame on you. You should be, so sign up for it. Pleasure to be here with Max Boot. And we're going to get right into it because Ronald Reagan lived for 93 years. Max Boot spent 10 years on this book, and we have 40 minutes. So we are going to get right to it. So Max Boot, thanks for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
I know that you've been on a book tour. Your book is getting more, it seems like it is taking a second wind. Like it's getting more media attention in the last couple of months, which I think is really interesting. It came out in the fall. Any idea why that is? It seems to be taking off a new life here.
I'm glad. I don't know why, except if it's finding an audience, I'm very happy, and certainly the critical reception has been more than I could have hoped for. So it's great to see that readers are reading it and appreciating it.
Why Ronald Reagan? There's so many people you could write about, so many historical figures. Why this one?
Well, I mean, Reagan was an incredibly influential figure in the life of the nation and in my own life. I mean, I grew up in the 1980s. I was a young Reagan Republican, and Reagan is certainly one of the more consequential presidents of the 20th century, really one of the more consequential presidents in American history. And as I was looking around in 2013 trying to figure out what I was going to write next, it occurred to me that there was a gap on the bookshelf, that there was not a definitive biography of Ronald Reagan. He had not been tackled by John Meacham, Robert Caro, Doris Kearns Goodwin, a whole bunch of other people. And so I felt like, and as we were discussing earlier in the green room, you know, anybody who's talking about Reagan biographies has to bring up what you aptly described as the Edmund Morris fiasco, which was the official authorized biographer Edmund Morris, who was a very talented writer, but was flummoxed by Reagan and produced this very strange book in the late 90s called Dutch, which was quasi-fictional, and it had Edmund Morris inserted as a character in Ronald Reagan's life, complete with fictional footnotes. So I kind of like to say that Edmund Morris's kind of breakdown to produce this book sort of created my opportunity to write a more conventional and more definitive biography. And so that's what I set out to do in 2013, to produce something that was neither hagiography nor hit job, that presented both the strengths and weaknesses, the successes and failures of Ronald Reagan.
I mean, there has to be an emotional appeal to an author, right? Do you go into a biography like this purely analytically? You're going to spend 10 years with a human being. Just as on a personal level, was there an appeal there of picking Reagan in that way and knowing I got to spend a long time with this guy?
Yeah, I mean, I think Reagan was an appealing personality. I mean, whatever you may have thought about his politics, I think there was a general consensus that he was a very likable person, and that even people like Tip O'Neill, who very strongly disagreed with Reagan on a host of issues, couldn't help but liking Reagan, because he was this very understated, modest, very self-effacing guy with a quip always at hand, and always very thoughtful and very down to earth. There's no better example of that than his ranch near Santa Barbara, which if any of you have a chance to visit, I would strongly encourage, because I think it really gives you an insight into the psyche of Ronald Reagan, and it's actually a pretty impressive insight, because the ranch itself, while it's on this wonderful piece of land with sweeping views all the way out to the Pacific, the ranch house itself is beyond modest. I mean, it's very small. It looks like it was furnished out of a flea shop. It has very dated, old-fashioned appliances. There's nothing fancy about it, and this was the place that Ronald Reagan loved more than any other place in the world. It wasn't, you can't imagine a U.S. president or a Hollywood star living in such modest surroundings today, but he did, and very happily so. And so I think there was kind of this appealing understatement, this appealing modesty about Reagan, which never left him, even as he scaled the heights of success. And I think that's part of what made him, not a bad person to spend a decade with.
I'm glad you mentioned the modesty. I think that's something a lot of people might be surprised about. Also, you describe it as an introvert.
Yeah, that's something that might surprise a lot of people, because he appeared to be somebody who was very warm, friendly, outgoing. That's certainly how he came across on TV. But in reality, he was actually an introvert who was close to almost no one. Even Nancy Reagan said that there were parts of him that were walled off even from her. And it's very interesting, because people who only saw him on the silver screen or on the small screen in TV in your living rooms, which people had been doing since the 1950s, thanks to General Electric Theater, and then of course as president, had this impression of this very warm, outgoing, maybe even backslapping person, whereas the people who actually were closest with him remarked to me that he had this glacial reserve. He was very distant. He was an introvert. He was a loner. He almost no real friends. So very different actual personality from the personality that he so successfully projected on TV.
Who were his parents?
His parents were Jack and Nellie Reagan. He grew up in very impoverished circumstances in early 20th century small town Illinois. His father, Jack, was a shoe salesman who had a terrible drinking problem. And so the family kept moving from one town to another, never staying in one place for very long. And that was part of the reason why Ronald Reagan, or Dutch Reagan as he was then called, had trouble getting close to anybody throughout his life, because when he was a little kid, he never stayed in one town long enough to make a lot of lasting friends. And of course, he also had this terrible family secret of his father's drinking that he didn't want the other kids to know about. So that's where he began to erect this mental barrier around himself, which stayed up until the end of his days. I mean, another aspect of his childhood, which also shaped his personality, was, of course, there was a lot of conflicts in the home, because Jack would tend to go off on multi-day benders, come back, having spent the family rent money on booze, and obviously Nellie was not very happy about that. And so little Dutch Reagan and his brother Moon could often hear these arguments through the thin walls of their rented houses, as a result of which Ronald Reagan developed this aversion to conflict, which again is something that might seem counterintuitive, because he was famously confrontational as a politician. He was the guy who fired the air traffic controllers in 1981, or said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." But in fact, in his private life, he was completely non-confrontational. And I had this fascinating conversation with his son, Ron Reagan, who was relating to me how when Ron was growing up in the 50s and early 60s, they would be having these conversations around the dinner table, and Nancy would usually be going at it with Patty because they had a very difficult relationship their entire lives. And Nancy would turn to the other side of the table and try to draw her husband into whatever dispute she was having with her daughter, and she would say, "Isn't that right, Ronnie?" wanting to, get her husband in on her side. And Ron Reagan remembers seeing his dad kind of moving his mashed potatoes around, trying to hide behind his broccoli. He didn't really want any part of this dispute. He just wanted to have this amiable, if somewhat superficial relationship with everybody, including his own kids. And that often, a consequence of that was he often didn't know what was going on with his kids' lives. He didn't know that when Patty was battling drug addiction, or when Maureen was beaten by her first husband, or when Michael was molested by a camp counselor. All these things he didn't find out until decades later. And when he was governor or president, it also made him very difficult for him to confront his aides, because again, he shied away from conflict. And so even when aides were at war with one another, as for example, George Shultz and Cap Weinberger were during the Reagan administration, he would never settle things because he wanted to be friends with everybody. So that was another aspect of his, another legacy of his childhood. And I would just, at the risk of trying your patience, one last aspect of his childhood was how he reacted to these very difficult circumstances. And this is really where his mother, Nellie's influence, I think, was foremost, because Nellie was this very religious, devout lady, disciples of Christ Church, who always had this very optimistic outlook on life, and in fact wrote, "The sunny side's the only side." And she inculcated her younger son, Dutch, with that same ethos. And so Ronald Reagan tended to see his childhood through rose-colored lenses as this wonderful time, and kind of blotting out the traumatic, desperate circumstances, the poverty, all the rest of it. And he tended to see everything else through those same kind of rose-colored glasses, looking at America as the shining city on a hill and overlooking, the defects that America has undoubtedly had. But that was part of his appeal, was that he had this soaring, optimistic vision, which again was in many ways grounded as a reaction to his very difficult, even traumatic childhood.
His father, despite being an alcoholic and causing all kinds of problems for the family, also in your book instills him with some really firm values. I wonder if you could talk just very briefly about that. And just as an example, his father wouldn't let the family go see Birth of a Nation, refused to let them see it. I'm not sure how common that would have been, especially for somebody who had a problem keeping his whole life together. But it seems like in that era, in Tampico and Dixon, is where Reagan sort of got that sunny side optimism, but also that sense of conviction of standing firm for your principles.
Yeah, well, remember, Jack Reagan was Catholic, and he was a Catholic at a time when there was terrible anti-Catholic prejudice in this country. And so he, viewed himself as being a minority and inculcated some of that ethos to Dutch Reagan. And of course, he did, one of Ronald Reagan's, favorite stories was about how his father would not let the family see Birth of a Nation, which of course was a paean to the Ku Klux Klan. But of course, remember, we tend to think of the Klan as being anti-black as opposed, discriminatory towards African Americans, which was true, but it was also anti-Catholic. And that was actually a big part of the KKK in the 1920s. They were ardently anti-Catholic, and so that was something that Jack Reagan reacted against. And Ronald Reagan always, cited these incidents, and there was a famous incident when he was at Eureka College, and he had a couple of black teammates on the Eureka College football team who weren't allowed to stay in a hotel in Dixon, or his hometown, because they were black, and so he brought them home, and of course his parents very happily took them in. He always brought up those examples to say, I don't have a prejudiced bone in my body, which may have very well been true, but it was also true, as I show in the book, that he did, as a politician, he did cater to white backlash politics from the mid-1960s on. I mean, he was somebody who opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He opposed the 65 Voting Rights Act. So he was certainly not above catering to white backlash politics, but he always took refuge in pointing out that he was brought up by his parents to oppose prejudice, and I think there is a lot of truth to that.
He saved 77 people, as far as we can tell, as a lifeguard. One of them, at least, he met in California when he was governor, and that young man, when he saved him, was a judge. You tell this great story of him meeting somebody whose life he saved.
Yeah, I mean, he did say this was when he was working as a lifeguard on the river in Dixon, in high school and in college on the Rock River, and there are a lot of skeptics who poo-poo his life-saving feats and say, girls were just pretending to drown because they wanted to be rescued by the handsome lifeguard. But in fact, and there may have been a few of those, but there were also a lot of guys who hated being rescued and thought that, he was their ego was offended that they had to be rescued. So it kind of worked both ways. But he really did become kind of a small town hero, and I think this was his first brush with celebrity. And one of the more revealing anecdotes, and Reagan was very opaque, very hard to get him to reveal what was going on with himself, which was part of the frustration for people like Edmund Morris. But one of the more revealing interviews he gave was to a movie fan magazine in the late 1930s. And in general, I found movie fan magazines to be one of my best sources on Reagan, at least when he was in Hollywood. But in this interview, he talked about what was so appealing to him about being a lifeguard. And what he said was he got to sit on this high chair, which was literally true. He got to sit this elevated platform, and everybody was looking up at him. And he kind of liked that. And I think that was his ego peeking out, because normally his ego was firmly in check. But that was an indication of, yes, he did have an ego, and it helps to explain how he went from this hard luck story in small town Illinois to becoming this big movie star in Hollywood, because he genuinely enjoyed having people looking up at him and being the center of attention.
So he follows his girlfriend to Eureka College,
right,
which he can't afford, negotiates a discount, he works there to help pay his way through, graduates, then he's got to make a decision on his career. He's got to go back home. There's a pivotal moment in his life after that.
Yes, when he graduates, Reagan graduates from tiny Eureka College in 1932 at the height of the Great Depression, where a lot of people are unemployed, and it's very hard to find a job. And it was at that point that history there was a fork in the road of history, where there was a Montgomery Ward that was opening up in his hometown of Dixon, and they were looking for a manager for the sporting goods department. And Dutch Reagan, having been on the high school and football varsity football teams, having been a varsity swimmer, he seemed like a natural to become manager of the sporting goods department, but he didn't get the job. And if he had, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about Ronald Reagan, because the guy who did get the job was still working there in the 1970s when Reagan returned to Dixon as a presidential candidate. So he didn't get the job at Montgomery Ward, and then he was looking around for something else to do. And he had these dreams of becoming an actor. He'd been a thespian in high school and in college in the Drama Society. But, poor boy in the Midwest, 1932, going to Hollywood seems about as realistic as going to the moon. But he was canny enough to figure out, well, there's no movie studios in the Midwest. but there are a lot of radio stations, so maybe I can get a job at a radio station. And so he went to Iowa and got a job at a small radio station, and very quickly did so well that he transferred to a bigger one in Des Moines and became known throughout the Midwest as Dutch Reagan, the voice of the Chicago Cubs and the Chicago White Sox. And that was, you know, he was tremendously successful by the standards of the day, but he still wasn't satisfied.
Now, I can say, having been a radio host, that to this day, you don't need any experience. They will put anybody in front of a microphone. But one of the things that strikes me in reading your book is, so Reagan had this sense where he was sort of shy and passive in social situations, especially around women. But in his career, appears to be remarkably assertive. He goes to the station, no experience. No, he just wants a job. And what does that tell you about him? Any insights there?
That's a great point. I mean, I think it tells you that he had tremendous drive and ambition. And again, this is something he carefully camouflaged because he was not the least bit obnoxious. And he always, for example, during his political career, which began in midlife for him, he always made it seem like he himself had no ambitions. He was merely responding to the call of the people, right? And he would run for governor if he was drafted. He would run for president if he was drafted. But in fact, as we know with Reagan, as with most politicians, the draft was kind of a sham. He was doing it because he really wanted to do it, and obviously for a combination of high-minded and as well as some egotistical reasons, as anybody would do pursuing any kind of career. But he had a tremendous drive, which he camouflaged before this kind of winning aw shucks personality and his self-deprecating jokes. But he really wanted to be a success, and he was not satisfied with even a modicum of success, which he already had by the mid-30s as a radio announcer in Des Moines. And he was already scheming about the next step, and he figured out that the Chicago Cubs took spring training in those days at Catalina Island off the coast of California, and so he wheedled an invitation to go with them and convinced the station owner to pay for the trip, even though the guy was a tightwad. And so he went out to California with the Cubs, and then he snuck away to Warner Brothers to take a screen test, and lo and behold, his screen test was successful enough that Jack Warner hired him, and all of a sudden he had gone from being this small-town poor boy to being successful radio announcer to all of a sudden now having an entree into the movie industry.
So he's in Hollywood. How many, you might not remember this off the top of your head, about how many movies did he make?
More than 60, I think, somewhere around there, around 60.
How many did you watch?
Not all of them. I watched quite a few. Some of them were not that watchable, frankly. I would not recommend the Brass Bancroft movies, which were kind of his version of Mission Impossible, where he was an action star in the late 30s playing Treasury Agent Brass Bancroft. And just the overall, those were B movies, and just the overall level of special effects and acting and everything, very hard to watch if you're used to, $200 million extravaganzas today. But some of them were, I mean, he certainly had some highlights. And the interesting thing about Reagan is he was very serious about his acting. And you could easily criticize his positions on policy, politics, whatever. He generally couldn't care less. But if you criticized his acting, he would genuinely get wounded. Like, he didn't like people making jokes about Bedtime for Bonzo because he thought that was a pretty decent picture. And actually, it's not a bad picture. It's a nice romantic comedy. And of course, he had his two most famous pictures. One was Newt Rockne, All-American, where he played George Gipp, the Notre Dame, or a very idealized version of George Gipp, the Notre Dame football star that had very little in common with the real George Gipp, who was a gambler, heavy drinker, reprobate in general, but Reagan played him as this wonderful martyr of the gridiron. And of course that timeless speech about win one for the Gipper, coach sometime when the boys are up against it and the breaks are going the other way, tell them, win one for the Gipper. And that he kind of assumed the identity of George Gipp and became known as the Gipper. And then King's Row, which was his most prestigious drama, which I'm not a huge fan of. I thought it was overly melodramatic, but that was, again, one of his signature lines where you know, he has his legs amputated by a sadistic doctor and wakes up and screams, "Where's the rest of me?" which he used as the title of his first 1965 memoir. So those are his biggest pictures. I think it was actually the romantic comedies where he was the strongest and the most winning. But I think the key point with his movie career is that by the time the U.S. was getting involved in World War II in 1941, Ronald Reagan had graduated from B Pictures. He was an A actor. He was sharing billing with Errol Flynn. So he was actually pretty successful in Hollywood until the war came along.
You have something in there that I didn't realize about his movie career, and this comes up later when he's president in handling his staff, is that he really didn't push back. If they give him a script and the studio wanted to do it, he would pretty much take it. He didn't do what a lot of actors today do, which is reject the bad scripts in hopes of getting, and that could explain a large part of why he sort of got stuck in a lot of bad movies. But there was something else in his Hollywood career that changed his life, named Jeane Wyman. How did that come about?
Yeah.
Because she became a legit A-list star.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm just briefly on your first point. Yes, I think one of the things that made Reagan so appealing to Warner Brothers, his studio, was that he was so hardworking and so little trouble, because everybody knew he didn't have the same level of talent or charisma as Errol Flynn, but everybody also knew that unlike Errol Flynn, he would show up on time, he wouldn't be drunk, he wouldn't chase underage girls, he wouldn't get, create bad headlines for the studios. Reagan was a guy who was very easy to work with. He hit his marks, he knew his lines, he did what was expected, and so people liked working with him. He was a hard worker and eager to please. Now, in terms of Jeane Wyman, that was Jeane became his first wife. They met at Warner Brothers. They were both under contract to the studio, but Jeane Wyman was although she also had very modest beginnings, came from the small town Midwest, she turned out to be a much greater actor than Ronald Reagan. She had much greater ambitions. And that wasn't apparent at first, because when they first hooked up before the war, and they got married, it was in 1940, I believe, they were, Reagan was, if anything, probably a somewhat bigger star, but then there was a role reversal after the war. He spent the war, he was actually making movies during the war too, but he was making them for the Air Force. He was generally not making commercial movies. He was part of an Air Force propaganda unit in Studio City, California. But in the meantime, Jeane Wyman's career was in overdrive, and so when World War II ended in 1945, Reagan's movie career was, had basically fallen apart. He wasn't getting the kind of parts, the A movie parts that he was getting before the war, whereas Jeane Wyman's career was taking off, and she was, appearing in prestige pictures. She was winning an Academy Award. She was becoming one of the biggest talents in Hollywood, and their interests were diverging because she was intensely focused on her movie career, which was more successful than ever, whereas Ronald Reagan, because his movie career was not successful, was focused on other things like politics and becoming president of the Screen Actors Guild. So he was getting involved in union activism and in politics, and those were not things that Jeane Wyman was interested in. And so, the funny thing about Jeane Wyman and Ronald Reagan is how passive he was, because it was really Jeane Wyman's initiative to marry Ronald Reagan. She met him and thought, this is the guy for me, and then she had to pursue him for a year or two to convince him to marry her. And she would pretend to do outdoorsy things, which he loved, and she didn't actually like, but she did it to win him over. But then things turned around in 1947-48, where Jeane Wyman decided that she was sick of Ronald Reagan and didn't like being married to him anymore, and so she decided she was going to divorce him. And just as Ronald Reagan had never taken the initiative to marry her, he was shocked when she took the initiative to divorce him. And that was, again, she was the person who was forcing the changes in the relationship, whereas Reagan was kind of on the receiving end. And of course, he was, very deeply unhappy about the divorce and really felt lost and didn't know, what he was going to do when they broke up in 1948. And
that was the only period in his life where he behaved even remotely close to the stereotype of a movie star, like dating he was a serial monogamist by nature, but you have this period where he dates a lot of young starlets, he gets out on the circuit, so to speak, and then he encounters a woman named Nancy. But before we get to that, you have an insight that I think is really interesting about his movie career. So Reagan being sort of this, all shucks, goody, good in the romantic comedies, but he could never play a heavy or a bad guy. After the war, he's the same Ronald Reagan. He didn't go overseas and fight. Everybody else is different. And the culture had changed. What movies people want to see had changed. The characters, that we have anti-heroes now. And I liken it to the difference between John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. And Reagan couldn't do Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, quite honestly, he couldn't do John Wayne either.
Right.
He was actually very aggrieved at Warner Brothers because, it's funny because the image that people have of his movie career is that he played a cowboy. In fact, he was not in that many Westerns. I think he was in 5 Westerns, and none of them were all that notable. And he was actually aggrieved about this. He complained to Jack Warner, because he loved to ride horses, he loved ranch life. So he said, why don't you cast me in more cowboy pictures? And Jack Warner wouldn't do it. And Reagan thought it was because Jack Warner didn't know what he was doing. But generally, Jack Warner knew what he was doing. And I think his perception was that Reagan was too nice a guy, and that to be convincing in these action pictures like John Wayne or Gregory Peck or whoever, name the star of the day, Robert Mitchum, that was another star. You had to have like this darkness about you. You had to have some danger about you. And Ronald Reagan just didn't have that. He was just a transparently nice guy. So that's why he was cast in romantic pictures rather than in action movies.
So he meets Nancy. She also seems like pursued him.
Yes, absolutely, she did.
What was their relationship like?
Well, it was one of the great romances in American political history, and it is astonishing how close they remained over the course of many decades. At the Reagan Presidential Library, you can still see in the Nancy Reagan papers, she collected all the cards that he sent her over the years, and every Thanksgiving, every Easter, Christmas, New Year's, July 4th, probably some other holidays I missed, he would send her this card and she would save them. And he would tell his colleagues when he would overhear them talking to their wives and they didn't say I love you, he would upbraid them and say, no, you gotta tell them, you always gotta say I love you. And anyway, they had this very famously tight relationship. So you can read Reagan's diary when he was president, and when Nancy Reagan was away from the White House for a few days, he would start feeling lonesome and didn't know what to do with himself because Nancy wasn't there. And that was, didn't start off that way, as you mentioned briefly. Again, Nancy pursued Ronald Reagan. She also had a difficult childhood where her mother and father divorced very early, and then her mother was a vaudevillian and she was on the road all the time. So Nancy didn't have a lot of stability until her mother married this neurosurgeon in Chicago named Loyal Davis, and then her mother devoted herself to helping Loyal Davis socially and in his career and building him up in Chicago society. And so that was kind of the model of being a wife that Nancy Reagan grew up with, or Nancy Davis, as she was then known, grew up with, and she wanted to apply. She started off as an actress, but she did not have the same talent or ambition as Jane Wyman. She never really wanted to be a professional actress. She wanted to be a wife and mother, and she was, became smitten with Ronald Reagan, who again seemed like this transparently good guy, but she found it hard to convince him to marry her, and she had to undertake this campaign of, just like Jane Wyman, of pretending she loved outdoorsy stuff and riding horses and painting fences and all this other kind of stuff, which I can assure you she did not like. And her daughter Patty told me that she even suspected Nancy of having deliberately gotten pregnant with Patty to force Ronald Reagan to marry her. We'll never know the truth of that. But anyway, they did marry, and it was this famously close-knit marriage, but it was more than that, because Nancy Reagan also supplied a lot of things that Ronald Reagan needed beyond the personal love and support, because she had a very different personality type from Reagan. He was very warm, very trusting, tended to assume the best of everything and everybody, almost Pollyannish, whereas Nancy Reagan was just the opposite. She was very skittish. She worried a lot. She assumed that people were out to get them unless proven otherwise. And so as a lot of folks who were close to them described it to me, she kind of became the HR department of Reagan Inc. She was the person who hired and fired on his behalf. She was kind of the counselor and the heavy who did the dirty work of politics that every successful politician needs. But Ronald Reagan was too nice a guy to do it for himself, and so Nancy Reagan was the one who went out and did it. And that's why a number of their aides told me if it hadn't been for Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan would have never been elected president. And it wasn't because she had any great political ambitions. It was just that she was so skilled and successful in looking out for his best interests in ways that he could not really do so readily for himself.
Who were Dennis LeBlanc and Barney Barrett?
Oh, great question. That's one of my favorite findings in the book. I looked around and I tried to say, you know, who were Ronald Reagan's close friends, and there were almost none. You have to go back to, you know, the 1950s in Hollywood when Bill Holden was the best man in his wedding, but then they drifted apart. And so by the 1980s, it's really hard to say who he was close to until I discovered Dennis LeBlanc and Barney Barnett, and two people that almost nobody has ever heard of. And who were Dennis and Barney? They were former California state police officers who were bodyguards for Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California. Barney was his driver and Dennis was one of his bodyguards. And then afterwards, they retired and went to work for Reagan basically as ranch hands on his ranch near Santa Barbara. And those were the people that Ronald Reagan actually most enjoyed spending time with in the entire world. You know, they would go out and they would clear brush and they would do chores on the ranch and, you know, just talk about, as Dennis said, normal guy stuff, no politics. Reagan actually had this wonderful line where he was once asked what he thought about when he was chopping wood, and his reply was, the wood, which is an aphorism worthy of Calvin Coolidge. Anyway, so they would, Dennis, Barney, and President Reagan would go out and spend all day tiring themselves out doing chores on the ranch, and then in the evening they would go back to this very modest ranch house for a very stingy dinner prepared by Nancy Reagan's housekeeper, because she was always watching her weight and made sure that Ronnie was as well. And so they would get up from the table almost as hungry as when they sat down, and then they would walk into the very modest living room and sit down in front of the TV and watch Murder, She Wrote or some other show of the 1980s and kind of fall asleep in front of the TV set until at some point Nancy would kind of tap Dennis or Barney on the foot and say, time to go to bed. And so Dennis and Barney would shuffle off to their trailer to sleep, and the housekeeper might slip them a couple of chocolate chip cookies along the way. And then the president and first lady would go off to their extremely modest bedroom a few steps away. And this was the life that Ronald Reagan most enjoyed. He enjoyed this way more than he enjoyed hanging out with Alfred Bloomingdale or Walter Annenberg or all these other grandees that he was so often photographed with. That was really Nancy's social circle. Dennis and Barney, those were really Ronald Reagan's guys.
I love that story. So he makes the transition to politics, runs for governor of California. Did this come out of nowhere? He does GE, right, for a while. Can you quickly sort of give us a sense of how and why this actor, they did the Screen Actors Guild president, but look, there's lots of Screen Actor Guild presidents. Why does he decide, A, I want to do this, and B, I can do this?
Well, I think there's two threads here. One is how did his interest in politics grow, and how did he go from liberal to conservative? Because that was obviously a huge part of it. Remember, he was a New Deal Democrat, somebody who voted for FDR 4 times. His own father was saved by the New Deal, finding work as an aid administrator in Dixon, and yet he made his first splash in politics in 1964, speaking on behalf of Barry Goldwater, a very conservative Republican. So how did that transformation come about? Well, part of it, I think, began during well, first let me just say that what Ronald Reagan often said about this transformation was not accurate, because he often said, I didn't desert my party deserted me, to suggest that the Democratic Party had lurched to the left, whereas in fact the Democratic Party in the 1950s was pretty centrist. In 1960, John F. Kennedy even ran to Richard Nixon's right on defense policy. So it wasn't the Democratic Party that had changed, it was Ronald Reagan. And how did that come about? Well, I trace it back beginning during World War II, when as a highly paid movie actor, he was very unhappy paying 90% income tax rates to the federal government. Then after the war, as Screen Actors Guild president, he got involved in the red hunts and in the political battles in Hollywood. He testified before the House Un-American Affairs Committee. He was an FBI informant, and he became convinced, largely because of his FBI contacts, that there was a made-in-the-Kremlin plot to take over the movie industry and that he was standing in the way. Now, I think this was somewhat exaggerated, but he genuinely believed this, and so it made him into this very hardline anti-communist. And then his transformation to the right was completed in the 1950s, and also where he learned how to be a politician, working as a spokesman for General Electric, which in those days was a very conservative company because GE looked on free market ideology as kind of as an inoculation against union troubles. And so they insisted that their managers read all these conservative publications. And so Ronald Reagan, as a very faithful and dedicated GE employee, would be subscribing to National Review or Reader's Digest, Human Events. He would be reading Hayek and von Mises and Whittaker Chambers and all these books. And then he would be moving to the right. But he was not just a passive consumer of information. He was also giving speeches all the time on behalf of GE to the Elks, Kiwanis, Chamber of Commerce, whatever club was in whatever town he was visiting. And he would often be using the information that he was gathering from all these sources in his speeches and he learned this method of index cards where he would write down facts or arguments on index cards and he would shuffle them when he was speaking. So he never gave the same speech twice. And then he would be judging the audience reaction as he spoke. And if a card resonated with the audience, it stayed in the pile. If it didn't, it went into the trash can. And so by the time he gave his famous Time for Choosing speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater, not only was he a very right-wing Republican, but he was also a pretty skilled speaker and a pretty skilled campaigner and knew how to give a speech that resonated with an audience. In fact, the Time for Choosing speech was basically the greatest hits of Ronald Reagan. The index cards that had worked the best over the previous decade on the two big themes that he developed, one of which was the threat of communism, and the other of which was the threat of big government at home, which he linked together. And that became a very popular message with his audience.
I think we're going to fast forward through the governorship because I think that's a nice transition. The themes of communism and taxes and economy. We get to the 1970s. A lot of us in this room lived through the 1970s, but some of you didn't. Not a fun time. Malaise, high inflation, economic contraction, unemployment. How does Ronald Reagan become, after Watergate, the new hope of the Republican Party?
Well, part of it was rooted in the fact that he was a pretty successful governor of California, and that was said to me by no less than Jerry Brown, who was his successor as governor, and was also the son of Pat Brown, the guy that he beat in 1966. He actually turned out to be a very pragmatic and centrist governor, which people would not have expected given his red-hot rhetoric on the campaign trail. So he had a pretty successful record to run on as he was seeking higher office. But his assumption had been that Richard Nixon, and he was a big Nixon supporter, his assumption had been that Nixon would serve out 2 terms, retire in '76, and then Ronald Reagan, as the former governor of California, would basically step forward as the next leader of the Republican Party. So Reagan was shocked in 1974 when Nixon had to resign during Watergate and Jerry Ford became president. And so he did not have a lot of respect for Jerry Ford, and Jerry Ford also didn't have a lot of respect for Ronald Reagan, but Reagan basically saw Jerry Ford blocking his path to the presidency because he was getting into his 60s, and so he thought this would be his only opportunity. And so he did something audacious, which many of his supporters counseled against, which was to mount a primary challenge against the sitting Republican president. And he actually came very close to success. He almost won the New Hampshire primary, very, very close. And if he had won in New Hampshire, he probably could have won the nomination in '76. He fell just short in New Hampshire and fell just short in winning the nomination. But at the '76 Republican Convention, the most memorable speech was delivered by Ronald Reagan, more so than whatever Jerry Ford said. And so a lot of people left the '76 Republican Convention thinking that they had nominated the wrong person. And so when Gerald Ford narrowly lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976, that finally left Ronald Reagan as kind of the last man standing as the natural heir in the Republican Party.
He developed some relationships, as one does, with folks in New Hampshire. Can you tell us some of that? Who did he get to know in New Hampshire? Who was important to him in running for president? You found some correspondence in his library that might be interesting to some folks here.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to recall all the details off the top of my head, but certainly, as I recall, Hugh Gregg was the chairman of his New Hampshire campaign. He did a lot to try to win over Naki Loeb. You can read in the Reagan archives their extensive correspondence, often with Naki Loeb often being somewhat irascible and writing letters of complaint to Reagan, complaining about whatever deviations from conservative orthodoxy she thought he was guilty of, and Ronald Reagan writing back to try to mollify her and assure her, I'm the same old Ronald Reagan as always. He had a very strong showing in New Hampshire in '76, fell just short, but then of course in 1980 he came back, and after a disappointing showing in the Iowa caucuses, had his famous moment here at the primary debate where he had that immortal line of, I paid for this microphone, Mr. Green, mangling the name of the editor who was hosting the debate, but it was showing this decisiveness which upstaged George Bush, who had done so well in Iowa, and that was one of his shining debate moments, which really set him on the path to the nomination and the presidency in 1980.
I love your description in that book of the Nashua debate. It's a gem in the book, and the problem that Mel Thompson gave the campaign because he was Mel Thompson. So people should check that part out. So he gets elected, beats Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is a technocrat. He's an intellectual. He's very bright. Reagan would constantly get criticized for not being very bright. I think that juxtaposition is interesting, that Reagan beats Carter, he beats Mondale. What takeaways do you have from that? I remember in the 80s hearing so much about, well, Reagan's he's not an intellectual. And it seems to me that the American voters really weren't looking for an intellectual. And I'm not sure that's even a criticism. So just kind of wonder about the political style, the management style, the vision that Ronald Reagan bought at the time against those two candidates that really set him apart and helped him win these big elections, when, again, a lot of people look back and go, well, he's how is this guy beating these people who are so well-versed in policy and politics?
Right. Well, I think it's fair to say that Reagan was not an intellectual. I don't think he pretended to be. He was certainly bright enough to become governor and to do the job as governor and president, as he demonstrated. I think he was, somewhat marred by an intellectual lack of curiosity, a tendency to kind of assume that what he wanted to be true was actually true. He tended to believe in higher truths, and then he would cherry pick facts or data that to support it without necessarily having, verifying whether it was accurate or not. And he certainly was not versed in the details of a lot of policies, and so this often frustrated, congressional negotiators who were trying to talk with him about the details of this bill or that, which he didn't really know, and he would defer to his aides. So you can often, I think that was actually a strength, and you can certainly paint it that way, that he kept his eye on the big picture, and Carter was famously criticized for being a micromanager, something nobody would ever accuse Ronald Reagan of. It could also be a weakness, however, as we saw during the Iran-Contra affair, when his aides were doing stuff they shouldn't be doing, and he didn't really know about it. So Ronald Reagan was very dependent on having good staff work. And when he had good staffers, for example, in his first term, he chose Jim Baker as White House Chief of Staff, and Baker turned out to be one of the all-time greats in that position. So Reagan was pretty successful. And then when Reagan allowed Jim Baker to swap jobs with Secretary of the Treasury Don Reagan in his second term, and Reagan turned out to be a horrible White House Chief of Staff, Reagan was not so successful. What I basically, conclude about Reagan is he was a pretty poor manager, but he was a great leader. And I think it was because he was a great leader that he was able to defeat this host of opponents who underestimated him, beginning with Pat Brown in 1966 and going on to Jerry Ford and George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter and Fritz Mondale and so many others. He really knew how to communicate, and it wasn't just a matter of reading teleprompter speeches. One of his closest aides, Stu Spencer, who recently passed away and was the architect of all of his winning political campaigns, what Stu said to me was Reagan was not only the best speech giver I ever met, he was also the best speech writer. He really understood how to communicate in this very simple, down-to-earth idiom, which he learned as a radio broadcaster in the 1930s and partly learned by emulating FDR. So he was a very powerful communicator who also had a very uplifting message. And this goes back to what we were discussing earlier, which was this sunny view of the world that he inherited from Nellie Reagan. And that was something that was really welcome in 1980, 1981, when, as you mentioned, America was at a pretty dark place where we had been through Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, the Iran hostage crisis. A lot of things had gone wrong. People thought the country was ungovernable. And here was Ronald Reagan coming in with this very sunny, optimistic vision of America as a shining city on a hill, convinced that our best days are still ahead of us, whereas Jimmy Carter alienated a lot of people with his famous malaise speech, although he didn't actually use the word malaise, but he talked about America as a nation of limits and we would have to accept a lower standard of living and so forth, and that wasn't what the American people wanted to hear. And so Ronald Reagan was able to communicate his vision and to inspire the country, and I think that's why he was so successful. But obviously, there were also a lot of stumbles along the way, in part because he was just not a very attentive or hands-on manager.
I think one of the word you probably use the most to describe Reagan in your book is pragmatist.
Yes.
And pragmatic. And I think that might surprise a lot of people who conceive of him purely as an ideologue. But you note all the compromises that he made during his presidency, not just domestically, but in meeting with Gorbachev and negotiating and angering people on both sides by trying to find a path to a solution. Can you just touch on that really quickly before you get to his legacy and questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was actually one of the things that people like Naki Loeb were complaining about in the mid-1980s, writing to Reagan and saying, you're getting snookered by this terrible communist Mikhail Gorbachev. But I think Reagan's genius was that while he did have strong convictions in office, he was able to put ideology aside to some extent and act in a kind of centrist, pragmatic fashion. As he often said, I'd rather get 80% of what I want and come back for more tomorrow rather than go over the cliff with my flags flying. And so he was always making compromises, whether it was with Jesse Unruh, the powerful Speaker of the California Assembly, whether it was with Tip O'Neill, the powerful Speaker of the House of Representatives, or with Mikhail Gorbachev in ending the Cold War. And when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, Reagan wasn't sure what to make of him. And of course, he had been a staunch anti-communist for many decades, but Margaret Thatcher told him this is somebody you can do business with. And after Reagan met Gorbachev in Geneva in the fall of 1985, he came to see that, yes, although Reagan was the #1 capitalist and Gorbachev was the #1 communist, they had a lot in common, that they both were fearful of nuclear war. They both wanted to wind down the arms race. And so I think Reagan deserves a tremendous amount of credit for discerning that Gorbachev was a sincere reformer, which was by no means a universal position at the time. And Cap Weinberger and other members of the cabinet were much more hardline. But Reagan, with George Shultz's encouragement, determined that he could work with Gorbachev, and that led to the first treaty in 1987 abolishing an entire class of nuclear weapons, the INF Treaty, and that set the stage for the peaceful end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I think that was a truly historic achievement. I don't subscribe to it. I regard it as myth that Reagan bankrupted and defeated the Soviet Union. I think in some ways what he did was even more impressive was he adjusted with the times, and he was able to make this very pragmatic decision to work with rather than oppose Gorbachev, and I think that gave Gorbachev the strength he needed to carry out these reforms that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I think when you think about Ronald Reagan and his legacy, you know, he had a lot of faults along the way, and I don't whitewash any of those, including the fact that he neglected the AIDS pandemic in the 80s. His policies, I think, contributed to income inequality, the Iran-Contra affair, a terrible scandal. A lot of things went wrong, but I think there's a reason why Reagan is still judged to be a great or near great president by most historians, and I think it really comes down to two things, one of which was, we just discussed, he kind of gave the nation its mojo back in the early 80s. He made Americans feel good about themselves, made them feel confident, made them feel like it was morning again in America. And his second great achievement in his second term was working with Gorbachev to peacefully end the Cold War, and I think those are two monumental achievements that ensure his place in history.
In writing this book, one last question before we get to the audience questions. Was there anything that you changed your mind about Reagan when you started, before you started to finishing the book?
Oh, there was a lot, and I think, you know, the big thing is what we were just discussing, because I think when I started, I tended to have this very simplistic view of Reagan as being just this kind of staunch and consistent conservative ideologue, and he certainly was that if you just read his speeches. But if you actually look at his actions rather than his words, you can see that he was actually much more of a pragmatist, much more of a centrist, somebody who, yes, he cut taxes, but he also raised taxes. Somebody who, as governor of California, signed the most liberal abortion law in the country, who, as president, signed a law that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. So his record, I think, is much more interesting and much less consistent ideologically than people suppose. And I think that, for me, was, I think, one of the most important facts about his career, and something that I didn't realize when I started, and I think most people probably still don't realize.
All right. Well, Max Boot, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I think we're going to... All right. I'm not being rude. I'm supposed to check my phone for questions if we had online questions.
Yeah.
So.
And we're taking audience questions. If you grab a card and submit it to me, we'll get it into the queue for the question.
All right. I'm loading. I've got the spinning wheel of death here. So as this loads, please, if you have questions, we have cards. You can write them down. We're not passing the mic, so we'll do cards and you can put them in. But I know we covered almost everything in the book, but not everything. So again, I think there's somebody going to come around with cards if you have questions. Is somebody delivering the cards, or do they have to go find the cards?
Either or.
Okay.
We have some coming around now.
Okay. I do have now, the spinning wheel has, it's loaded. So I'm looking at our online questions. In your view, these are all marked anonymous. So in your view, did Reagan's ability to compromise benefit the U.S. during his presidency or weaken it?
Oh, I mean, I
That's
think
the question.
That's an easy one. I would say it benefited the U.S. I mean, his ability to compromise meant that he wasn't just somebody who was making futile gestures as president. He was actually getting stuff done, and he wasn't getting it done by executive order. He was getting it done by actually convincing Congress, even when Congress was dominated by Democrats, to actually pass legislation that he supported.
I like this question too. Would we call Reagan a populist in today's terms?
He certainly had populist tendencies. I mean, one of the most memorable lines from his 1981 inaugural address was, "In the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem." And he certainly spent decades assailing this elite in Washington, and even oddly enough, even when he was president, he was still acting as if he were this outside agitator instead of the actual head of the government. So he certainly tapped into populist passions, which were unleashed by the failures of, Vietnam, Watergate, all the stagflation, all the problems that we had in the 60s and 70s. And I would add in general, and we're seeing this today, inflation is often the force that gives rise to populism. Was certainly the case in the 1980s. But I think Reagan's populism and his, bashing of the federal government was much more measured and mild than what we see today. And remember, he actually wanted to downsize the government, but he didn't, set the 1980s version of Elon Musk loose to defund government agencies. He commissioned a businessman named Peter Grace, who headed up a commission that made recommendations to Congress for how you can cut government spending. And he passed a monumental tax and spending bills in 1981, what became known as Reaganomics, which cut personal income taxes and which reduced some federal spending, although overall spending went up on his watch. But he was somebody who believed in working through the democratic process and compromising with the opposition. He didn't believe in carrying out vendettas by executive order.
I really appreciate that you got the preamble to that quote as well. Most times you hear this quote of Reagan saying government isn't the solution, it's the problem. People leave out the preamble where he mentions in this present crisis,
Right.
which I think is an important part of that discussion. As we see in his career, it wasn't the case that he thought the government was always bad
Right.
and always did wrong.
Right,
I
and
think
he wasn't trying to destroy the government. He was
Yeah.
trying to make it work more effectively. That was his
Right.
goal. And of course, in his own personal life, his father Jack was rescued by the New Deal. He was a New Deal aid administrator in Dixon. So, from his own life, he understood the good the government could do.
Do we have questions from the audience at this point? Anything?
All the audience questions are getting
Are they?
fed
They're,
to you through the
oh, they're coming through the app?
Yes.
No way.
Very high tech.
Technology. Wow.
This newfangled technology. What will they think of next?
Okay, I'm going to try to load these. So, okay. Wow, okay. They are loading up. That's great. Was there anything you hoped to learn, find, or explore that you did not find or couldn't get access to?
I mean, there's always going to be questions that historians struggle to answer. And, there were a lot of things where there was no definitive answer. For example, I explored the issue of the October surprise in 1980. Did some of Reagan's aides try to convince the Iranians to keep the hostages past the election so as not to provide a boost to Jimmy Carter? And there is some evidence that Bill Casey, who was his campaign manager, did that, but it's certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no smoking gun there. There's also the question of, did Reagan know about the diversion of funding from arms sales to Iran to the Nicaraguan Contras in contravention of the Bolin Amendment during his second term? And again, the weight of the evidence suggests he probably didn't know about it, but it's not definitive one way or the other. So there's always going to be questions that historians struggle to answer. And what I tried to do in this book was just to present my knowledge of what the evidence showed on both sides, and to say there's some uncertainty here, so readers have to figure out for themselves how they weigh the evidence. But here's what I found.
Was Ronald Reagan a true conservative, or do we read our conservative politics onto him?
No, I mean, I think he was a true conservative, but again, as I was saying before, he really believed in all this stuff, but he was also a true pragmatist. So he was a very pragmatic conservative, and I think both words are very important in understanding him. Again, he was not somebody who just said my way or the highway, and this is my program, love it or lump it. He was somebody who understood the way the democratic system worked. And remember, going back to his time in Hollywood, he had been a labor negotiator, so he was experienced at negotiating with the studio bosses. So he didn't have any problem with the give and take of negotiations, whether it was with studio bosses, with Democrats in Sacramento, or or Washington, or as we were discussing with Mikhail Gorbachev. So he had these principles to which he stayed true throughout his whole life, but he was very flexible in their application and willing to compromise, much more so than a lot of other people. And I think Reagan's genius was that he made these compromises without losing the support of the Republican base. I mean, if you remember, George H.W. Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Then he agreed to tax increases, and that greatly hurt him in his 1992 re-election campaign. Whereas Ronald Reagan, he raised taxes a ton of times, and the Republican base never turned against him because his rhetoric always convinced them that his heart was in the right place. And they often said, oh, you know, he's getting bad advice, or he's listening to moderates or squishes or what have you. But that was really Ronald Reagan, that he was able to kind of govern very pragmatically and still keep the support of his conservative base.
One last really random question. A listener wants to know about the impact that Tony Dolan had on Reagan as a speechwriter.
Oh, gosh, that's really hard to answer. I mean, Tony Dolan was the chief White House speechwriter for a number of years, and obviously a very skilled speechwriter. I was amused, by the way, I recently saw the Reagan movie, which made Dana Rohrabacher, who was a junior speechwriter, a central character and seemed to ascribe to Dana all of Ronald Reagan's best lines, many of which were written by Tony Dolan or by Peggy Noonan or somebody else. But anyway, Reagan certainly had a very strong speech writing shop, and Dolan was certainly the leader of that for a number of years. But I mean, I think the important thing with Reagan is that his speechwriters often changed, but Ronald Reagan always sounded pretty consistent, and he had been sounding pretty consistent going back to long before he had any White House speechwriters. So the Reagan voice, the Reagan message, the Reagan style of communicating, that was truly Ronald Reagan himself. And then his speechwriters were pretty skilled at channeling that message, and some of them were very, very good. And a number of them were very, very good, but they weren't really putting words into his mouth. And I think, although I think there was kind of a tension in the White House, and people tend to romanticize the role of the White House speechwriters under Reagan, and they romanticize their own role because they viewed themselves as, we are the keepers of the flame, and it's Dick Darman or Jim Baker or these other moderates who are preventing Ronald Reagan from doing everything that we want because we are the true conservatives. They didn't really, well, they didn't spend that much time with Ronald Reagan. They actually complained about how little time they spent with him. But what they didn't realize was that Ronald Reagan greatly valued people like Dick Darman or David Stockman or Jim Baker because he understood the need for that true blue conservative message that the speechwriters were crafting, but he also understood the need for pragmatic compromise and getting things done in Washington. And those were both aspects of Ronald Reagan, whereas the speechwriters tended to focus on the conservative rhetoric and to blame others for actions which were often inconsistent with that rhetoric, even though at the end of the day, you know, as Reagan, you know, liked to say, you know, quoting Truman, the buck stops here.
And the event stops here. So thank you very much, Max Boot. Appreciate your time. Thank you. And we're going to have, I know there's a book signing. I believe it's out